The Abraham Accords were a major accomplishment for the Trump administration in the Middle East. Now those agreements could be facing serious challenges because of President Biden's foreign policy.
The White House team has some different plans for the Middle East. And as Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, they could weaken the United States' standing in the region and help countries like Russia.
When President Biden came to visit both Israel and Saudi Arabia, things began to change in the region as agreements for mutual defense between Israel and neighboring Arab countries began to fall apart.
The security architecture, publicly at least, unraveled. It was canceled, and the UAE instead is now trying to reestablish diplomatic relations with Iran, as are some of the other countries. So it seems that they measured the United States' commitment to confronting Iran up, measured it as too weak, and are trying to come to some terms with the Iranians.
Middle East expert David Wurmser says the unwillingness of the Biden administration to present a credible military threat towards Iran puts the Sunni Gulf countries in a vulnerable position.
Because alone, they really can't stop the Iranians. They can't defend themselves effectively against the Iranians. So they only have one or two choices. One choice is to try to grovel in front of the Iranians, which is the path they're beginning to show some sign of. The second path is to find a new strong horse, a new patron of power that can help defend them.
In addition to the defense concerns, the Biden administration is also making a change to the Abraham Accords by reintroducing the Oslo framework for Middle East peace talks, by bringing in Jordan, Qatar, and the Palestinian Authority. But other countries don't support that idea.
The Saudis, the other Arabs, they do not like the PLO. They do not like what they're doing in various areas. So by forcing that back in, it actually threatened the Abraham Accords. Again, fortunately, I think the overriding interests of the countries are so strong that the Abraham Accords will survive, but it will not be with U.S. coordination.
Former special envoy for the Abraham Accords, Aryeh Lightstone, says these Gulf countries are frustrated.
And there is a feeling of, what are we going to do for the next 26 months?
Lightstone says if the U.S. doesn't lead, other nations are waiting to take over.
There's no coincidence that Putin showed up to Iran just as Biden left the region. There's a competition here. If the U.S. doesn't lead, Russia or China will. It's absolutely in our interest to lead. And those countries want to be led by us. They want to follow with us. They want to stand next to us. They don't want to sit next to Putin. They don't want to sit next to the Chinese. They're not interested in that. But if we're not there, the Russians and the Chinese are.
Well, Chris Mitchell is joining us now from Jerusalem. So, Chris, there's a concept in the Middle East about the strong horse. How does it apply to what we're seeing now?
Well, the whole idea about the strong horse, Gordon, is that applies to really how things work in the Middle East. The nations, they'll follow the strong horse. Now, to be the strong horse, you not only have to show that you are powerful, but you also have to show you're willing to use that power. Now, nations can either follow the strong horse for their protection, like some of these Sunni Arab nations, or because the U.S. has the power, or they fear the strong horse because it will use its power. So here in the region, this is how it's working now, Gordon. It's clear that the U.S. has the power, but it's really unclear to many in this region, like Israel and these Sunni Gulf states, that the U.S. will use its power. So in effect, the question they're asking, will the U.S. be the strong horse? Some nations are already answering that questions with their actions. That's making nations like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, sort of shrinking back to protect their own interests. That's why the UAE is trying to reestablish diplomatic relations with Iran, since they're not sure if the U.S. is going to back them up. It's also making Israel making statements like they'll have to go it alone if they have to, just sort of like the IDF chief of staff said last week. So on the other hand, it's making nations like Iran, because the U.S. may not be the strong horse in the region, bolder because they don't think the U.S. will use its power to stop them.
I don't understand why the Biden administration would try to change the framework for the Abraham Accords. We finally had something that was working, that was bringing peace to the Middle East, bringing peace to the region. Why in the world would they change the framework?
Well, I think, Gordon, it goes back to what we talked about even last week. The Biden administration seems to be going back to this whole concept of a two-state solution and wanting to include the Palestinians. Now, bringing the Palestinians into the Abraham Accords in the minds of some, like we talked to earlier today, would be reversing the achievements of the Trump administration and the Abraham Accords. And the reason why, the Palestinian Authority sees the Abraham Accords as a threat. And so they want to undermine the Accords. So the Abraham Accords, in effect, took away the Palestinian veto for more than 20 years. I'm sure you remember former Secretary of State John Kerry said in December 2016 there'd be no Arab country would make peace with Israel unless the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would be solved. The Abraham Accords proved him wrong. Now the Biden administration seems to be going back to that whole concept of a two-state solution, bringing the Palestinians even into the Abraham Accords. And as R.A. Lightstone, who we talked to earlier today, he said that would throw a wet towel on the Abraham Accords.
Well, what he did in saying, based on the 1967 borders, he has to know that's absolutely impossible. You can't have that. Israel could never accept it. And the oddest thing is the Palestinians don't want a two-state solution. What they want is Israel off the map. So we finally had an administration willing to stand up to the Palestinians and say, no, you don't get to bully us. You don't get to have your way. You don't get to continue to preach this ideology. We're no longer going to continue to fund it. And it now seems like this giant reset. Is this sort of the U.S. foreign policy establishment reasserting themselves, or, what's behind the policy change?
Well, I think a lot of people say it's the third term of the Obama administration, and this was the policy of the Obama administration. Now the Biden administration, many of the same players in both administrations that are working right now with President Biden to establish this foreign policy. And the whole idea basically is simplified. They want to appease Iran. That's why they went back to the negotiating with Iran over the Iran nuclear deal and going back to a two-state solution. That was an evidence last week when President Biden was here. He visited eastern Jerusalem without an Israeli flag on the car. He talked about a two-state solution going back to the 1967 lines, as you mentioned. So that's what seems to be happening. The foreign policy that was there for 8 years with Obama is now in the third term, as some people say, with President Biden.
Well, let's talk about the meetings. Putin, Russia, joining with Turkey, having meetings in Iran. It's right out of the book of Ezekiel. You look at chapter 38 and you go, wow, an alliance that's really unlikely is now coming together. So is there a possibility of war with Iran? And in that, is Israel really going to go it alone?
Well, that's sort of the big question right now in the Middle East. It does seem more likely, not less, of a possibility of war. The reason for that is the U.S. is perceived as weak in the region. So while these nations are making their own decisions on their own national interests, and Israel is saying they may have to go it alone. That's what the IDF Chief of Staff Kohavi said just last Sunday, and that was following President Biden's trip. And so, as R.A. Lightstone said in our report, no coincidence that Putin is in Tehran just a few days right after President Biden. They're making the statement that they say they want to be the strong horse in the region, and they want to have bolder policies there in the Middle East, more relations with Iran and Turkey. And as you said, it does seem like a prophetic perspective unfolding right now in the region. All the more reason that seems war's more likely. People need to be praying for the region and for the peace of Jerusalem.